There comes a night when distraction fails. The television goes dark. The house grows quiet. The phone stops buzzing. And for the first time in a long time, they are alone with their own thoughts. Not with you. Not with their image. Not with the story they crafted to justify what they did. Just themselves. You see, during the day, they can perform. They can smile. They can speak confidently. They can move through life, pretending nothing unsettled them. But when the lights go out and silence settles over the room, something else begins to speak. Memory, conviction, the weight of what was done. Scripture tells us in Psalm 32 that when David tried to keep silent about his wrongdoing, his bones grew weary through his groaning all day long. Night and day, the hand of the Lord was heavy upon him. That is not poetry alone. That is spiritual reality. There is a moment when God allows silence to become a mirror, and they cannot look away. You have not chased them. You have not harassed them. You have not forced a confrontation. Yet, still, the truth stands in the room with them. And this is where the shift begins, because you are not pursuing them. The truth is, your calm has become their disruption. They expected noise. They expected a reaction strong enough to justify their version of events. They expected anger they could label as instability. They expected tears they could dismiss as weakness. They expected you to fight in a way that would allow them to point and say, "See, this is why I did what I did." But what they did not expect was your composure. There is something profoundly unsettling to a narcissistic personality when the person they wronged does not collapse, does not chase, does not retaliate, especially for those who understand relationships as leverage and emotion as currency. Your steadiness feels like a system failure. The script they rehearsed in their mind depended on your outrage. Instead, you chose restraint. You chose prayer. You chose dignity. And that choice has done more to disturb them than confrontation ever could. For a believer in midlife, someone who has walked through betrayal, disappointment, loss, and still remains anchored in faith, calm is not denial. It is conviction. It is the quiet assurance that God sees what others attempt to conceal. Psalm 37 reminds us, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him." That kind of stillness is not passive. It is powerful. It communicates that you are no longer trying to force justice with your own hands. And that is where the disruption begins. Because when you stop reacting, they lose their emotional foothold. When you stop explaining, they lose the opportunity to twist your words. When you stop defending yourself, they are left alone with the narrative they constructed. And without your resistance to push against, their version begins to feel hollow. Your peace has removed the battlefield. They prepared for combat. They did not prepare for composure. There is something deeply destabilizing about facing someone who has been wounded by you but refuses to be defined by it. It creates cognitive dissonance. They assumed their actions would leave you fractured. They assumed you would orbit their behavior, replaying every word, demanding clarity. But you stepped back, not in defeat, in surrender to God. And surrender, when authentic, carries authority. For someone accustomed to controlling perception, your refusal to perform pain disrupts their psychological balance. They can no longer read you easily. They cannot measure your response. They cannot manipulate the tempo of your emotions. You have become unreadable to them, and that uncertainty unsettles them more than anger ever would. Especially in the later seasons of life when reputation, legacy, and community standing matter deeply. Being unable to predict how someone might speak about you creates quiet anxiety. You have not threatened exposure. You have not broadcasted the details, yet your silence carries weight. Because silence paired with strength feels intentional, and intention feels dangerous to someone who prefers control. What they are experiencing now is not your retaliation, it is your withdrawal of emotional supply. And when that supply disappears, they are forced inward, into reflection, into memory, into conscience. Your calm has removed distraction. Without your visible distress to focus on, they must confront their own behavior. And for many narcissistic personalities, that is the most uncomfortable terrain of all, because reflection requires humility, and humility is not natural to someone who built identity around superiority. So instead of reacting to your anger, they are reacting to your steadiness. Instead of defending against accusations, they are wrestling with quiet conviction, and that wrestling intensifies because your peace looks like alignment. Alignment with God, alignment with truth, alignment with something higher than the temporary satisfaction of proving a point. For someone watching from a distance, especially someone in their 50s or 60s who understands the long-term consequences of pride, that alignment becomes intimidating. They may not articulate it this way, but they sense it. You are not operating from emotion anymore. You are operating from clarity, and clarity is difficult to manipulate. The longer you remain composed, the more they feel the contrast. Your sleep stabilizes, theirs does not. Your conversations grow lighter. Theirs feels strained. Your worship deepens. Theirs feels interrupted. It is not that you are celebrating their discomfort. It is that you are no longer entangled in it. And that detachment has shifted the balance, because when someone cannot provoke you, cannot destabilize you, cannot re-enter your emotional orbit, they are left facing something far greater than your reaction. They are facing the truth. And the truth, when left unchallenged by chaos, grows louder. Your calm has not ended the story. It has simply changed the direction. Now, instead of you moving toward them for answers, the pressure is moving them toward you. They realize they are no longer center stage in your life. At first, they did not notice the shift. It was subtle, quiet, almost invisible. But over time, something undeniable began to surface. They were no longer the center of your emotional world. For a long season, your reactions affirmed their significance. Even conflict kept them relevant. Your questions, your attempts to understand, your need for clarity, all of it confirmed that they still occupied space in your thoughts. But something changed. You stopped circling the same conversations. You stopped replaying their words. You stopped seeking their explanation. Not because you forgot, but because you entrusted the matter to God. And when a believer truly releases something into God's hands, the release carries weight. It is not avoidance, it is alignment. They begin to sense this alignment in you. Your tone has shifted. Your posture has shifted. Your focus has shifted. You are no longer emotionally orbiting what they did. You are moving forward, and that movement unsettles them more than anger ever could. Because when someone with narcissistic tendencies realizes they no longer command your emotional energy, they feel displacement. Influence has quietly slipped from their hands. They expected you to remain reactive. They expected you to stay engaged. They expected to matter at that level. But now, you are not trying to decode them. You are not trying to convince them. You are not trying to repair something single-handedly. You are stable. You are grounded. You are not waiting. And that realization creates an internal tremor. For someone who draws identity from relevance, losing that position feels like erasure. Not public erasure, but emotional erasure. They begin to wonder if they are slowly becoming peripheral in a story they once dominated. This is not about pride alone. It is about control. When they were central, they could influence the narrative. They could adjust perception. They could shape how events were remembered. But if you no longer center them, they lose that leverage, and they can feel it. They sense a door narrowing, not because you threatened it, but because you stopped chasing it. You are not holding it open in desperation. You are walking forward in dignity, and in that forward motion, they see something that unsettles them deeply. You no longer need their confession to move on. You are already at peace, and if you are already at peace, then their silence no longer controls the outcome. That is when the pressure intensifies. Because if they do not speak soon, they risk becoming irrelevant to your life entirely. Not hated, not attacked, just no longer significant. For someone who once relied on your emotional engagement, that possibility feels heavier than guilt. Anger could keep them central. Conflict could keep them involved. But your calm progression forward quietly removes them from the spotlight. And in that dimming light, a realization forms. If they want any place in the story again, even as someone who made a mistake, they must speak. Not because you demanded it, but because time is moving. And when God gives someone the grace to move forward without bitterness, He also begins pressing the one who stayed silent. You have shifted. You are no longer standing in yesterday's wound, and they are beginning to understand that if they remain silent much longer, they may not have access to your life at all. That awareness is not dramatic, but it is powerful, because irrelevance feels heavier than humiliation, and that weight is slowly pushing them toward a decision. The subtle misalignments begin to multiply. It does not begin with exposure. There is no dramatic unveiling, no confrontation, no moment where everything collapses at once. Instead, it begins beneath the surface. Life continues outwardly. They go to work. They hold conversations. They maintain routines. From a distance, nothing appears fractured. But internally, something has shifted. Sleep no longer restores the way it once did. They may lie down exhausted, yet wake with a heaviness that lingers. Not panic, not fear, just an undefined pressure resting quietly in the background of their mind. Their patience shortens. Minor inconveniences feel disproportionate. A simple delay becomes irritation. A small disagreement feels larger than it should. It is not chaos. It is subtle disruption. The sense of rhythm they once relied on begins to feel slightly out of tune. Decisions require more effort. Confidence feels thinner. Conversations demand more energy than usual. Nothing catastrophic, but nothing settled either. The absence of peace is rarely loud. It is not always an explosion. Sometimes it is simply the inability to fully relax. The feeling that something remains unresolved, unfinished, unspoken. Isaiah 48:22 says, "There is no peace for the wicked." It does not promise immediate disaster. It speaks of peace, or rather, the absence of it, and that absence begins to echo quietly through their days. They may attempt to explain it away. Stress, fatigue, circumstances. But explanations do not restore calm. The restlessness persists. Moments of silence become uncomfortable. When distraction fades, memory surfaces. Not in dramatic flashbacks, but in brief flashes, a sentence spoken too sharply, a decision made too quickly, a truth withheld when it should have been acknowledged. These memories do not shout, they repeat, and repetition wears down resistance. The more peace evades them, the harder it becomes to ignore the connection. Your name may surface unexpectedly in their thoughts. A conversation about integrity may strike deeper than usual. A sermon about truth may linger longer than it should. They begin to sense that the unrest is not random. You are not attacking them. You are not demanding answers. You are not escalating conflict. You are steady, which means The tension cannot be blamed outward. And that is where awareness begins to press inward. The human spirit was never meant to carry concealed truth indefinitely. Silence has weight, and the longer it is carried, the heavier it becomes. They start to recognize that something in their life feels slightly misaligned, not broken but unsettled, as if forward movement meets quiet resistance at every step. At first they push back against the thought. Pride resists association. Rationalization offers alternative explanations. But rationalization does not restore peace. Peace remains absent. And slowly, a question begins to form. Not spoken aloud, not confessed, but present. Is this connected to what I did? That question is the beginning of accountability. And once that seed is planted, it grows. The exhaustion of maintaining the false narrative. There is a hidden cost to deception that few people calculate in advance. Keeping a distorted version of events alive requires constant vigilance. Every conversation becomes a potential threat. Every shared memory becomes something that must be carefully navigated. They must remember what they said last week. They must recall how they framed the story months ago. They must ensure their tone matches their earlier posture. Image management becomes a full-time assignment. At first, this feels manageable. Control has always been familiar territory. They are accustomed to shaping perception, to adjusting language, to presenting confidence even when uncertainty exists beneath the surface. But sustaining a narrative that is not fully anchored in truth requires ongoing effort, and effort accumulates. There is a quiet strain in monitoring every word, a tension in guarding against contradiction, a subtle anxiety in wondering whether someone might compare notes, might question a detail, might notice an inconsistency. Even if no one challenges them, they still feel the pressure internally, because they know, and knowing changes the weight of silence. The human mind can carry many things, but carrying what is not aligned with reality demands energy. It demands alertness. It demands control. Over time, control becomes exhaustion. The lie may not collapse outwardly, but inwardly it drains. They begin to feel mentally crowded. Thoughts that once felt sharp now feel cluttered. Small interactions require more effort. Conversations demand calculation. It is tiring to perform stability when something unresolved lingers beneath it. There is also the burden of anticipation. Will this come up again? Will someone ask? Will the truth surface unexpectedly? Even in moments of calm, a subtle readiness remains the readiness to defend, to explain, to redirect. That readiness prevents rest. They may not describe it as fatigue, but they feel it. It shows up in irritability. It shows up in shortened attention. It shows up in an undercurrent of tension that does not fully subside. The more they attempt to preserve the false narrative, the more they realize how much effort it requires to sustain it. And gradually, another thought begins to emerge. What if confession would require less energy than concealment? Not easier in pride, not easier in appearance, but easier in weight, because truth, once spoken, no longer needs to be maintained. Truth stands on its own, but deception must be carried. The longer they carry it, the heavier it becomes. They begin to sense that the strain is not simply emotional, it is spiritual. There is a disconnect between what they present and what they know. That disconnect creates internal friction, and friction, when prolonged, wears down resistance. They may find themselves imagining the moment of release. What would it feel like to stop calculating, to stop guarding every detail, to stop protecting an image that demands constant reinforcement? For someone accustomed to strength, this realization is unsettling, because admitting truth feels like surrender. Yet continuing the performance feels increasingly unsustainable, and so confession begins to take on a new meaning. Not humiliation, not defeat. Relief. Relief from rehearsal. Relief from vigilance. Relief from the constant management of perception. The more exhaustion builds, the more attractive relief becomes. But relief is not simple, because confession changes positioning. It shifts power. It removes the shield of control. It exposes vulnerability, and vulnerability is risky. Speaking truth means surrendering narrative dominance. It means accepting consequences. It means stepping into a space where reaction is no longer predictable. They know that once words are spoken, they cannot be withdrawn, and that awareness sharpens the tension. The weight of silence grows heavier. The fear of confession grows stronger. They stand between two pressures: the exhaustion of concealment and the risk of honesty. The longer they remain in that space, the more unbearable it becomes, because fatigue erodes pride, and sustained strain weakens resistance. They are beginning to realize that they cannot maintain both the false narrative and their peace at the same time. Something must give, and the closer they move toward relief, the more they recognize what that relief will cost. But relief comes with risk, and that risk pushes the tension higher. The fear of being exposed without control. There is a difference between choosing to speak and being forced into revelation. And for someone who has carefully managed perception, timing matters almost as much as truth itself. Confession, if initiated voluntarily, can be framed as courage. It can be positioned as growth. It can be presented as integrity awakened. Exposure, however, strips away narrative control. It does not wait for preparation. It does not allow rehearsal. It does not ask permission. And that is what unsettles them most. Not merely the possibility of truth emerging, but the possibility of truth emerging without their direction. If you speak first, if someone else uncovers a detail, if a forgotten piece of evidence resurfaces, if a conversation once thought private becomes public, the balance shifts instantly. They are no longer the author of the story. They become the subject of it. And losing authorship feels threatening, because control has always been their safeguard. Control over tone, control over pacing, control over which details are highlighted and which are minimized. But control over truth is fragile. The longer truth remains concealed, the more unpredictable its exposure becomes. They begin to calculate outcomes. If they confess now, they retain partial authority. They can soften the impact. They can present remorse as intentional rather than reactive. But if the truth surfaces independently, it reframes everything. It suggests concealment. It suggests resistance. It suggests unwillingness to take responsibility. And perception, once altered, is difficult to restore. For someone who values image, not merely vanity, but the structure of how they are seen, this possibility is deeply unsettling. Reputation feels like architecture. It takes years to build, but it can fracture quickly when trust erodes. They begin to sense that silence, once protective, is becoming dangerous, not because you are threatening exposure, not because you are applying pressure, but because silence has a shelf life. Truth buried too long begins to destabilize foundations. They may start to feel a subtle paranoia, not extreme, but present, a wondering whether conversations are happening beyond their awareness, a questioning whether someone else knows more than they assumed. When a person lives with concealed truth, even innocent interactions can feel loaded. A simple question feels like investigation. A passing comment feels like suspicion. The mind becomes alert, scanning for risk, and constant alertness prevents rest. What once felt secure now feels fragile. What once felt controlled now feels uncertain. They begin to realize that the longer they wait, the less predictable the outcome becomes. Confession would mean surrendering control intentionally. Exposure would mean losing it abruptly. That distinction weighs heavily. They start to imagine worst-case scenarios. They envision how it would look if the truth surfaced unexpectedly, how it would feel to respond under pressure rather than by choice. And that imagination intensifies the tension, because they understand something crucial. Timing is narrowing. The foundation beneath silence feels less stable than before. What once felt solid now feels brittle. What once felt hidden now feels vulnerable. They sense that remaining quiet may no longer protect them. It may endanger them, and that awareness changes everything. Fear begins to press harder than pride. Because pride can tolerate confession, but it struggles to survive exposure. And as this internal instability deepens, the tension sharpens. Silence no longer feels neutral. It feels risky. And this instability builds toward a moment, the moment that breaks the stalemate. Stalemates feel permanent. Two sides standing in silence, neither moving, neither speaking, both aware that something remains unfinished. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening, but inside, pressure has been building for a long time. Silence is not empty. Silence accumulates weight. For a while, they convince themselves that the quiet meant stability, that as long as no one forced the issue, it would remain suspended, unresolved, but contained. But unresolved truth does not stay neutral. It gathers force, and then there comes a moment. It may not be dramatic. It may not involve confrontation. It may not even involve you directly. It might be a Sunday morning when a message about integrity lands differently than it ever has before. Not general, not abstract, personal, or it may be something simpler. They see you. You are living. You are worshipping without heaviness. You are speaking without hidden tension. You are not circling what happened, and that realization strikes harder than accusation ever could. Because they expected your pain to anchor you. They expected your silence to mean you were waiting. They expected your restraint to mean you were still entangled. But you are not entangled. You are free. And in that freedom, the stalemate shifts. Until now, the silence felt mutual. It felt like a quiet contest of endurance, who would speak first, who would bend, who would break. But when they perceive that you are no longer waiting for them to act, something changes. You are not standing at the door expecting their confession. You have placed the matter before God. You have released the timeline. You have stepped forward. That is when the stalemate stops being between two people. It becomes between them and conviction does not tire. They begin to realize something sobering. You are not holding the tension anymore. You are not replaying the moment. You are not negotiating internally about whether to speak. The weight has shifted entirely. And when that recognition settles in, pride loses ground. Because resisting you felt manageable. They could justify distance. They could rationalize silence. They could frame it as strength. But resisting conviction is different. Conviction does not argue. It presses quietly. It returns in the night. It surfaces in prayer. It lingers after distraction fades. At some point, the realization becomes unavoidable. You are no longer stuck in what happened. The only thing still suspended is the truth. And once that becomes clear, the stalemate cannot hold. Because a stalemate requires two participants. If you have stepped out of the struggle, they are standing alone. Alone with memory. Alone with awareness. Alone with the growing understanding that the only unresolved element left is honesty. The moment that breaks the stalemate is not explosive, it is decisive. It is the instant they understand that silence no longer protects them, it isolates them. It is the instant they see that you are not waiting for closure to live. And in that instant, something inside them yields. Not because you forced it, not because circumstances demanded it, but because they finally see clearly. Resisting you was one thing, resisting conviction is another. When they confess you are no longer where you once were, when the confession finally comes, it will not arrive the way you once imagined. There was a season when you thought those words would change everything. When you believed that hearing them say it out loud would heal the wound, settle the doubt, restore the balance. You waited for clarity. You waited for acknowledgement. You waited for someone to finally admit what your spirit already knew. But by the time the confession reaches you, something far more important will have already taken place. God will have reshaped you, because while they were wrestling with silence, God was building strength in you. While they were protecting their image, God was restoring your identity. While they were calculating timing, God was teaching you how to live without needing their validation. So when they speak, it will not rescue you. It will confirm you. You will notice something surprising in yourself. Your heart will not race the way it once did. Your voice will not tremble. You will not feel desperate for every detail. You will feel steady, and that steadiness is evidence of growth. The confession is not the miracle. Your peace is. There was a time when their silence felt like power, when the absence of truth felt like injustice, when you questioned whether you would ever see accountability. But now you understand something deeper. Silence never belonged to them. Timing belonged to God. Truth does not surface because we force it. It surfaces because God decides the season is right. And when it does not just expose wrongdoing, it reveals character, theirs and yours. It reveals that they struggled with honesty, and it reveals that you learned how to trust God without it. That is the part many people miss. The real testimony is not that they confessed. The real testimony is that you no longer needed them to. For those listening right now, this is the value you must take with you. Do not measure your healing by their apology. Measure it by your ability to rest before it arrives. Do not anchor your identity to someone else's admission. Anchor it to the one who already saw everything. Because if your peace depends on their confession, then they still hold influence over your heart. But if your peace is rooted in Christ, then their confession becomes secondary. It becomes confirmation, not completion. You do not need them to tell you who you are. You already know. You do not need them to admit what happened for your discernment to be validated. God validated you long ago, and when the confession comes, you will hear it differently. Not as revenge, not as triumph, but as release. Release for them because they could no longer carry it, and confirmation for you because you already released it to God. This is maturity. This is spiritual authority. This is what happens when someone chooses surrender over striving. You stopped chasing justice. You chose trust instead, and trust matured into peace. The confession may close a chapter, but your growth wrote a new one long before they spoke. That is the deeper blessing. You learned that you can live forward without extracting truth from someone who resists it. You learn that God is capable of pressing hearts you cannot. You learn that time, when placed in God's hands, does not protect deception forever. And most importantly, you learn that your stability does not depend on their integrity. It depends on God's faithfulness. So when the words finally leave their mouth, you will not feel elevated. You will feel grounded. Because the real victory was never their surrender. It was yours. And surrender, when given to God, always produces peace, long before it produces proof. That is the freedom you carry. That is the testimony you live. And that is the value you keep long after the confession fades.